In the hallowed halls of American democracy, a specter is haunting the nation, casting a shadow of uncertainty and fear over the future of our economy. As the 2024 presidential election looms on the horizon, a growing chorus of experts and analysts are sounding the alarm, warning that the very process of choosing the next leader could unleash a tidal wave of inflation that threatens to engulf the country in economic chaos. The stakes could not be higher, and the consequences of the choices made in the coming months will reverberate through the lives of every American for years to come. The numbers paint a stark and sobering picture. A study that focused on election cycles in 23 countries, including the U.S., found that uncertainty rose in the months leading up to and immediately following the election. Average economic policy uncertainty values were 13% higher in the month before and the month of national elections than in other months during the same election cycle. In the U.S., economic policy uncertainty increases were pronounced and highest around close and highly polarized presidential elections. The elections of 2000, 2016, and 2020 are the most recent examples. In those cases, uncertainty lingered after the election due to a slowdown in political appointments following the election. Political brinkmanship has been on a long-term upswing within Congress, which is further fueling the uncertainty after elections. Goldman Sachs Research's analysis of more than 1,100 elections in 152 developed and emerging markets suggests that primary fiscal balances as a share of GDP declined by about 0.4 percentage points on average in election years. That reflects both spending increases and revenue declines. The effects tend to partially persist into the year after the election before fading after 2 years. As the 2024 U.S. presidential election race heats up, history suggests that the current gloomy economic metrics would exacerbate the challenges the incumbent administration faces. In this video, we will delve into the myriad ways the upcoming election could impact the already fragile state of the American economy. We'll explore how election-induced uncertainty, political polarization, and fiscal policy shifts contribute to economic instability. The economic landscape of the United States has always been closely intertwined with its political climate. Historically, presidential elections have acted as inflection points for the economy, often causing fluctuations in market confidence and investor behavior. The anticipation of potential policy changes and the uncertainty surrounding the electoral outcome can lead to volatility in financial markets, affecting everything from stock prices to interest rates. The 2024 presidential election is particularly critical for the U.S. economy. In recent years, the country has faced a series of economic challenges, including the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, which disrupted global supply chains and led to unprecedented fiscal stimulus measures. While these measures were necessary to stave off a deeper recession, they also contributed to a significant increase in the national debt. Inflation has become a prominent concern, with the Consumer Price Index reaching levels not seen in decades. Rising prices for essential goods and services have strained household budgets, leading to a decline in real income for many Americans. At the same time, wage growth has not kept pace with inflation, exacerbating economic disparities and fueling public discontent. The political landscape has also grown increasingly polarized. The last few election cycles have seen deep divisions within the electorate, with contentious debates over issues such as immigration, healthcare, and climate change. This polarization has led to legislative gridlock, making it difficult for policymakers to address pressing economic issues effectively. It is against this backdrop of economic peril that the 2024 presidential election will take place, and the stakes could not be higher. For incumbent presidents seeking re-election, the temptation to pull out all the stops to boost the economy in the short term can be overwhelming, even if it means sacrificing long-term stability and prosperity. Historically, this has been a recipe for disaster. In the run-up to the 1972 election, President Richard Nixon famously pressured the Federal Reserve to keep interest rates low in a bid to boost growth and secure his re-election. The result was a massive spike in inflation that would plague the country for years to come, as prices for everything from food to fuel to housing skyrocketed out of control. More recently, in the months leading up to the 2020 election, President Donald Trump repeatedly called on the Federal Reserve to slash interest rates and pump more money into the economy, even as the country was already awash in cheap credit and the stock market was soaring to record highs. While the Fed ultimately resisted resisted these calls, the pressure from the White House undoubtedly contributed to the sense of uncertainty and instability that has plagued the economy in the years since. Now, as the 2024 election approaches, there are growing fears that history may be poised to repeat itself. With President Biden facing an uphill battle for re-election and the economy still reeling from the aftershocks of the pandemic, the temptation to resort to short-term fixes and easy money may prove too great to resist. Trailing Trump in the polls for months, Biden has sought to elevate the extensive federal spending on infrastructure, climate change, and other projects to bolster his economic record. His campaign has run ads touting these laws in 7 battleground states to boost recognition and counter voters' inflation-driven pessimism about the economy. While the details of the plan remain sketchy, it is clear that it will involve a significant injection of federal funds into the economy at a time when many experts are warning that such stimulus could be dangerously inflationary. At the same time, there are growing calls from some quarters of the Democratic Party to embrace even more radical measures to boost growth and combat inequality, such as universal basic income or a job guarantee program. While these proposals remain largely theoretical at this stage, they reflect a growing sense of urgency and desperation among many on the left who fear that the country is teetering on the brink of a social and economic catastrophe. For the average American, the prospect of a presidential election fueling even higher inflation is a deeply troubling one. Already, millions of families are struggling to keep up with a rising cost of living as wages fail to keep pace with prices and the purchasing power of the dollar continues to erode. According to a recent survey by Bankrate, nearly 61% of Americans are now living paycheck to paycheck, with little or no savings to fall back on in case of an emergency. If inflation were to spike even higher in the months ahead, the consequences would be devastating. For low-income families and those on fixed incomes, such as retirees and disabled Americans, even a small increase in prices can mean the difference between making ends meet and falling into poverty. According to a recent report by the AARP, a 1% increase in inflation can wipe out an entire year's worth of Social Security cost of living adjustments, leaving millions of seniors struggling to afford basic necessities like food, housing, and healthcare. For middle-class families, the impact of rising inflation can be equally severe. As the cost of everyday goods and services continues to climb, many Americans are finding themselves forced to make difficult choices between paying for essentials like rent and utilities and saving for long-term goals like retirement or their children's education. According to a recent survey, 25% of workers cut their retirement savings because of financial pressures created by inflation, and almost half of those, 12%, stopped saving entirely. Hispanic Americans were impacted the most. They were twice as likely, 24%, to stop saving altogether, and 40% saved less. Small businesses, too, are feeling the squeeze of rising prices and economic uncertainty. According to a recent survey by the National Federation of Independent Business, 22% of owners reported that inflation was their single most crucial problem in operating their business, up from just 8% a year ago. Many are struggling to keep up with the rising costs of supplies and labor, even as they face increasing pressure from customers to keep prices low. Perhaps most worryingly, the specter of rising inflation in the midst of a presidential election could have profound implications for the stability and cohesion of America's democracy itself. As Americans struggle to make ends meet and the economy continues to teeter on the brink, the temptation to seek out scapegoats and embrace populist demagoguery and razzmatazz may prove too great to resist. In this context, the prospect of a presidential election fought against the backdrop of soaring inflation and economic chaos is a profoundly troubling one. As candidates on both sides of the aisle seek to tap into the anger and frustration of the American people, the risk of further violence and unrest cannot be ignored. At the same time, the pressure on policymakers to take drastic action to combat inflation and boost growth could lead to a dangerous erosion of democratic norms and institutions. Already, there's been a breakdown of traditional checks and balances as presidents and legislators alike have sought to circumvent the will of the people and impose their own agendas on the country. If inflation continues to spiral out of control in the months ahead, the temptation for those in power to resort to even more extreme measures may prove too great to resist. From price controls and rationing to the seizure of private property and the suspension of civil liberties, the history of countries in the grip of hyperinflation is a sobering reminder of the dangers that lie ahead. Perhaps most worryingly, the combination of rising inflation and political uncertainty could create a perfect storm of economic instability and social unrest. According to a 2022 report by the Brookings Institution, periods of high inflation have historically been associated with increased political polarization, populist uprisings, and even violence. In a country already grappling with deep divides along racial, economic, and ideological lines, the prospect of further upheaval is a deeply troubling one. If the federal government continues to run large budget deficits and the Federal Reserve maintains its easy money policies, inflation could rise again from its nominal state. If inflation were to spike again, it would have several significant implications for the average American. First and foremost, the cost of living would increase substantially. Essential goods and services such as food, housing, healthcare, and transportation would become more expensive, eroding the purchasing power of consumers. This means that the same amount of money would buy fewer goods and services, leading to a decrease in the standard of living for many families. Those on fixed income, such as retirees, would be particularly hard hit, as their income would not adjust to keep pace with rising prices. Additionally, higher inflation would most likely bring back higher interest rates for Americans as the Federal Reserve attempts to combat rising prices. This would increase the cost of borrowing for everything from mortgages to car loans to credit cards, making it even more expensive for individuals to finance major purchases. Higher interest rates would also impact businesses, leading to reduced investment and slower economic growth. Small businesses, which often rely on credit to manage cash flow and finance expansion, would be particularly vulnerable. Compounding these concerns is the fact that the tools available to policymakers to combat inflation are increasingly limited. With interest rates already at historic lows and the federal government facing record high levels of debt, the traditional levers of monetary and fiscal policy may be less effective than in the past. According to a 2023 report, central banks worldwide may struggle to contain inflation in the coming years as the global economy becomes increasingly interconnected and the effects of national policies spill over across borders. As the 2024 presidential election looms and the specter of inflation haunts the American economy, the nation stands at a crossroads, facing a choice between short-term political expediency and long-term economic stability. The decisions made in the coming months will echo through the lives of every American for generations to come, shaping not just the trajectory of the nation's economy, but the very essence of the American dream that hopefully doesn't lie in tatters. If you like this video, hit the like button and help us spread the word. And don't forget to subscribe to get notifications on our latest news and analysis. In the meantime, check out one of these videos here to learn more. Thanks for watching.